I just want to do God's will.
The kind of revolution that the world needs is a Christian revolution.
If you want a miracle, you've got to expect it to happen.
You are the recipients of God's grace and God's blessings, and you rejoice in that reality.
Welcome to Life Today Live. Randy Robertson here. I have a question for you. Have you ever had a point in your life where, you're moving along and the things that seem important suddenly are not important? And a lot of times that comes at a crisis point, and things that you were worried about yesterday, you realize, I shouldn't have been worried about that because there are more important things in life. I think a lot of times we do that. We make the little things really big, and when something bigger comes along, it obviously changes your priorities. Well, we're going to give you permission today to reprioritize, to say, you know what, that thing that I was really sweating, probably shouldn't sweat. And I'm going to focus on the things that are actually really, when you get down to it, important. And the other things, you know what, I think I will just keep them light. There you go. There's the book by Joël, Malm, Keep It Light, The Freedom of Priorities in Life, Work, and Love. And I got to tell you, this is, if you get this and you're one of those, worriers, or maybe you just have too much clutter in your life, this is liberating. This will help you breathe, help you sleep at night, and help you enjoy life more. Joël, welcome back to the program. Good to see you, man.
Yeah, you too. Good to be with you.
Now, it's easy for, wait, okay. Actually, first, I told myself yesterday, I'm like, okay, I'm going to ask him this first. Here's the book again. Is that you standing on the mountain on the cover?
That's the most asked question. No, that is a stock photo chosen by the publisher. I wish it was me. I've got some pictures like that, but that's not me.
Well, yeah. and that's why I ask. Actually, before we get into the book, I just go ahead and give people the overview, because you're the dude that I keep telling my wife, one of these days, Machu Picchu, one of these days, right? So tell people what your ministry does.
Yeah, so my goal, my two driving forces, I want to help people have wisdom and perspective in life. And the perspective side of it, the way we do that is we do it through outdoor adventures. And I've just found, you take people out and you, like my friend Mark Batterson says, change of pace plus change of place equals change of perspective. And that's just what happens. People are like, wow, how do you do that? I'm like, well, I don't do anything. I just take them out in the outdoors and it happens. So we take people, hike Machu Picchu, climb Mount Kilimanjaro, raft the Grand Canyon. And it's funny because a lot of the examples in this book, you probably noticed, come from hiking, because in really a lot of ways, life is like a long hike. The things you learn on like a hiking a long trail, if you can get those in your life, particularly how much weight you're carrying in your backpack makes a huge difference how far you go. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I like that. And that's so true. And that's what I was talking about at the beginning, because you start to really see the priorities in life. And it's helpful when you unburden yourself of things. So what are some of the things that you hit in this particular book?
Well, kind of the way I lead out the book is I say, if the burden of life is too heavy to handle and you're just wake up day after day going, I just can't do this anymore, there's a very good chance you're carrying something you were never intended to carry, or trying to carry it on your own. Because Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. He says, take my yoke upon you, for I'm gentle and lowly in heart. He says, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. And a yoke was just simply a big old piece of wood they'd put over two oxen, and they would share the load to carry a plow. But I think it's an interesting analogy, because he's saying there is a burden we're all called to carry in life. There's certain responsibilities that when we take those responsibilities, they give a deep sense of meaning to us. One of the challenges I see in our world today is a lot of people running around trying to not take responsibility. Well, that's just too much work to have kids or whatever it is. And those are the things, those responsibilities, they give life meaning. So Jesus is saying, hey, there's a weight you've got to carry, but if you're linked up with me, it's going to be something you can bear. And when these oxen are walking along together, if one gets ahead of the other or runs a little too fast, you're going to end up carrying too much weight. So the goal is to stay in lockstep with Jesus. And a lot of that has to do with what we value. If you want to know what somebody values, you look at what they do, not what they say or think or feel, because what we do shows what we truly value, and that's how we decide what we're going to prioritize.
You used another word there, and I'm curious about it. You said in that same passage, Jesus says he's lowly in heart. Is that the word that's used there, lowly?
Depending on the translation.
On the translation. Okay, so I actually just did a study for another verse on lowly, because Paul says, I think it's Paul, he's saying to associate with the lowly. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? And the literal translation is close to the ground. And you go, okay, so what's the connotation there? Well, there is humility, because the physical act of getting down on your knees or on your face before, there's that humility. But there's also the aspect of beat down, like those who are just beat down. And Jesus is saying, look, be close to those who are in a place of emptiness, right? Those people who have been carrying the loads and who are at the point of emptying themselves. You've stumbled, you've fallen, you've hit the ground. It's not sinful in nature necessarily, although sin can force you to your knees or to your face before God in repentance. But that's interesting that he would say he is close to the ground in heart.
Yeah,
I kind of like that, and what you do literally in nature, taking people out on the ground, close to the ground in the sense of physically. I don't know. There's something I think God's designed to give us the better perspective, and to unburden us from the stuff that the world and the enemy wants to put on us.
Yeah, that's a great point you made too. That it's not necessarily. This is one of the things I've found. It's not necessarily the sinful. There's all sins we struggle with, but most of the time, the things that end up wearing us out are good things that we just keep adding to our backpack. The sinful things, we kind of know they're there. We know they're a stumbling block, but it's the good things we just keep adding. And it's like a hiker that'd be out one day going, I've heard there's bears in the area. I might need a rock. So you take a rock, you put it in your backpack, and then you hike along. You're like, what if there's 2 or 3 bears? So you just keep adding rocks to your backpack, because you may need them. And before you know it, you're like, wow, this is a lot of weight on my shoulders. And they're not bad things, but it's just too many things, and you can't carry everything. And that's where you got to go, Lord, what is it that is truly the most important for me to be carrying? So
when you wonder, maybe, am I carrying too much of my backpack, metaphorically? Literally, having hiked some myself, you pick something up, you go, yeah, I can carry this, and you go. But after half a day, and when it starts to get hot and you start to get a little dehydrated and you're having to, make sure you're drinking enough liquids, weariness sets in. Is weariness a really strong clue that you may be carrying stuff you don't need to carry?
Absolutely. Weariness. By the way, just for clarification, we're not talking about hiking anymore. We're talking about life. Right. We're actually talking about what we do in life, because people are like, well, I don't hike. No, this is the way it is in life. Right. Weariness is one. What I think, what I've found, so when I go hiking, what normally happens is people that come with me, it's their first time to do anything like this, which is what I want. I want people like that. But what ends up happening is some person at the outdoor store saw them coming and said, if you don't have all this gear, you're going to die. Yeah. So I've got my packing list, but they come with 3 times what's on the packing list. So the night before, I will usually have a gear weigh in. I'll tell them I need you to keep it at this weight. And it's amazing to me. I take executives, CEOs. I've seen powerful men, large heads of large organizations, nearly reduced to tears as I pull things out of their bag and say, you don't need this. And they're like, but what if I do? And they freak out. I mean, it's like grown men nearly in tears about this. And you're like, come on, guys, grow up. I've done this trail a lot. You're not going to need it. But I think that's the fear we all have. You had an experience of not having something you thought you needed at one point. And so you go, I'm just going to take it with me. And that's where it just gets heavier and heavier. And what's really interesting is, if I were to take the same gear that I take to climb Mount Kilimanjaro to go and hike in the jungles of Costa Rica, it just wouldn't work very well. And a lot of times what we do is we just take everything with us. And it's like in every season, there's a different challenge. I don't need a parka to hike Arenal Volcano in Costa Rica. I'd be a fool to take a parka to hike Arenal Volcano. But how many of us do that? We end up taking things that were great for one season of life. And in that hike, that challenge you faced then, but you don't need them anymore. And that's where we're constantly having to reevaluate, Lord, do I need this in this season? Or is this something I'm holding on to out of fear?
Well, that's a great question. 2 side notes. I didn't know you hiked Costa Rica too. I freaking love Costa Rica. And can I get you on the phone next time my wife and I go on vacation so you can talk to her before she packs? Just ask him.
Ironically, I just got back from a trip and I took all these clothes and I wore 3 pairs and I came home with 7 pairs of clean clothes. I'm like, I still do it. I still do it.
Yeah, we all do. That's hilarious. All right. So one thing I will ask you about, and we're going to stick with the hiking analogy because I think these help. Why did Jesus talk in parables to? Well, because he's talking to fishermen about fishing, to farmers about farming. I think it helps us see a greater truth. So, but bear with me. If you don't have to be a hiker to get this one, but I will say that, the first time we hit where we were at Arches National Park in Utah, which is amazing, out of this world amazing. And there was this one where we had been, it's called a hidden arch, and you go up this rock, like the mountain just looks like a giant rock. You look like you're on the moon, and you're doing this, and there's people to your right and way to your left because it's all wide open. And when you get up to the very top, it narrows, and you're like, one step to the left, and it's over. And literally someone had fallen and died there like a month prior to us getting there. And you go, well, so, my wife does not like heights, and so it was a little difficult for her at times. And you get up there and you go, you know what? I think I'm enjoying this, but I think I need some boundaries. Mm. And once you stick to the boundaries, you go, okay, I'm going to step up. It was a lot easier to relax and enjoy because we weren't pressing the boundaries, and it's like, if you want to get over there, and there's something, I think, to saying you want to keep it light, have some good boundaries.
Yeah.
What do you see?
My favorite author is G.K. Chesterton, and he says the chief aim of God's order is to give room for good things to run wild. And there was a classic study done many years ago, and it's had a lot of iterations. There was a new school, it's built right along a freeway, and when they opened the school, there was no fence along the schoolyard. All the kids stayed really close to the school. As soon as they put a fence in, the kids ran and played all over the place. Mm. And what they discovered is kids need boundaries, but kids aren't the only ones that need boundaries. We need to know what the limits are of where it's safe to play in. And that's the beauty of God's order, is he says, hey guys, there's stuff that's just not good for you. It's not good for you. It's not, Paul says, all things are permissible, but not everything's profitable. Mm-hmm. Here's the boundaries. If you stay within this, you've got room to run wild. And what I talk about in the book is I define boundaries as prioritized love. It's the idea that you've only got so much time, only got so much money, you only got so much energy. You want to make sure that you're giving your best to the people that are closest to you and that God says deserves most. In my opinion, that order is God himself deserves your best, then it's your spouse, and then it's your kids, and all the other stuff is up for grabs. Love God, love people. That's the 2 greatest commandments, love God, love people. That's the order. And everything else is up for grabs. And it changes in every season. But I think those are the priorities that always need to be in place. And all you're doing with a boundary is saying, I love you, but right now my best time and energy needs to go over here. And, if you look at Jesus, he had some pretty strict boundaries. He ministered to lots of people, but there were certain times he only talked to the 12. There's a really interesting hint in the Bible when you're reading. And he says, it'll say in the Bible, and then he went into the house. When you see he went into the house, it means he's about to give some kind of insider information to the circle of 12. Mm-hmm. And then inside that 12, there was even the 3, Peter, James, and John, the inner circle. There's nothing wrong with having a prioritized love, and because you can't give everybody to everything. And if everything has the same priority, nothing has priority. Yeah. There's certain people that deserve more of your time, money, and energy, and that's where we end up sometimes making the wrong sacrifices. We sacrifice our family, maybe trying to do too much at work, and it's a really tough boundary to figure out. Where is that?
Yeah, it gets worse in ministry. So I want to ask you about that perspective, but I want to show people the book again. This is Keep It Light by Joël, Malm. You get it wherever you get books. It's a light read, and it's not a G.K. Chesterton. So you will actually be able to keep your reading light, but yet get the depth of the benefit and the encouragement that Joël will give you. And so you talk about the boundaries and the priorities. And you mentioned Jesus' relationships. and how some it's not the bad things that always creep in and weight us down. It can be the good things. You know what my dad's like? He said this too many times in my adulthood. I'm like, I'm fine. Get over it. You don't have, but he has come back and apologized and said, man, I am sorry that I was gone most of your childhood, because he was out saving the world, right? He was out preaching, sometimes 300 days out of the year, and a few years in there. And so my mom basically raised me, and I didn't think anything of it. It was normal, as all I knew. But for him, he realizes that he didn't prioritize right. And he took too much of a burden on himself. Even, like a God-given gift of evangelism. And he regrets it to this day. How do we properly fit in church, God's call on our lives with the priorities? Because even Jesus would pull away from ministering to people to go spend time with God, And so I think we have precedent, but man, that's a tough one for a lot of people who feel like God's called them to do something, and then it becomes the everything.
Ministry is particularly hard, because you got into ministry because you felt this desire to serve the Lord.
Right.
But if you've ever worked at a church, I call it ministry creep. You get hired to do this, but there's this and this and this and this. And when the volunteers don't show up, you do this and this and this. Yeah. There's a quote I put in the book. It's kind of jolting. It was A.W. Tozer. Everybody sees him as a great man of God. His wife, when A.W. passed away, Aiden was his name. Somebody interviewed his wife and said, and she remarried a businessman. And they said, what's it like? You were married to A.W. Tozer, one of the preeminent theologians, and now you're married to a businessman. What's it like? And she said, I've never been happier in my life. A.W. loved God. This man loves me.
Oh,
it's
wow.
like, ouch.
Yeah.
That's potent. I mean, I highly respect A.W. Tozer, but it's interesting that a lot of guys, as they get further down in their life, they realize, I think it's incredibly amazing and humble of your father to say, probably could have done that better. And there's grace. Look, there's so much grace, man. Grace, God brings grace when we make mistakes and we don't get it exactly right. And you're an example of that. We're all an example of that. But it's really interesting how many great men of God, because the burden is so heavy on them, that the world needs Jesus. Mm-hmm. But it's finding that balance of yes, and Jesus is the one who's going to empower the mission to do it. But it's a hard balance to find.
Yeah, it is. Even Ruth Graham has struggled with that, and her dad was Billy Graham, because especially that era and that method of preaching, your dad's not there when you're growing up, and for a lot of kids, that's tough. I was pretty independent, so I don't whatever. But if you're a pastor, by the way. If you feel like you're being called to ministry, I don't. The scripture that says you have to hate your wife and your mother and father or whatever, your family, I don't think you're taking it in context if you think that's an excuse to neglect the God-given wife and children that you have. I think they're your first mission field and your priority for ministry. And I think a lot of pastors have gotten it wrong. It's why PKs, preachers' kids, pastors' kids, have the rap that I know, right? And it's a generalization, but there's some truth in it. So if you're in that role, man, reprioritize, and that's what Joel's calling us all to do. Where does somebody start, do you think, if they're like, okay, these guys are talking and I'm feeling it. Well, yeah. How do you begin that process of taking the rocks out of your backpack, metaphorically?
Here's the first thing. This book started for me when I knew when my daughter was coming along, and I didn't know how much a kid costs. I think all men kind of freak out when a kid comes along. Like, how much a kid cost?
Yeah, don't tell us up front, otherwise we'll never do it.
So I started this business, and the business just took off, right? I mean, we were killing it. More money than I've ever made in my life. Haven't even made that much again. And I remember one Monday, we were pushing my daughter around, newborn daughter, and I turned to my wife and I said, isn't it amazing? Here we are on a Monday, and nobody's telling me what to do. Money's rolling in. We're getting to do ministry and business. Isn't this amazing? And she's quiet. And I'm like, Emily, isn't this amazing? And she goes, yeah, it's great for you, but I'm drowning over here. I was so jolted because I thought life had never been better, but somebody in my own home was drowning and I missed it. And I think one of the most important things we can do is, first of all, evaluate what are the relationships like in your life, and ask them, hey, do you feel like you're getting the best of me? And if they're not, you go, wow, I need to reevaluate something here. And you could always write it off. Well, I'm doing this for you. I'm spending all these hours at work for you, sweetheart.
Right.
You really need to value your motives. And man, I'm telling you, the older I get, the more I'm like, I don't even know my own motives. That's that psalm that I go back to over and over again, where David says, search me and know me, O God. See if there's any unclean way in me. Sometimes we can really justify our motives, even with spiritual things. You can give a spiritual justification for your motives. And so you need to evaluate, what are the motives? What are you really doing this for? A lot of men I work with that are executives, they say, well, I'm doing this to give my kids everything I never got growing up. I want to give them the Air Jordans, right? I never got the Air Jordans. And I want to get my daughter cheerleading camp, but really, when we get to the core of it, they say, I just don't want to be poor. And so that's what it is.
Well, yeah, and I was going to say, it's materialism. It's got it. At the end of the day, is it materialism? Is that what's eating us up?
I think a lot of it is that, the feeling of not having had. So you go, I'm going to make sure that never happens. That inner vow we make. I'll make sure that never happens again. So you evaluate your motives. And I mean, Lord knows, thank God for the Holy Spirit, because we can't even evaluate our own motives, but the Holy Spirit comes, he brings conviction. And then when that happens, one of the exercises I talk about in the book is you got to figure out what is the most important thing. And there's an exercise I do for executives. I do it for corporations and stuff. I say, what are your priorities? And we make a list. I give them like 60 things, and I tell them circle it, then narrow it down. And for me, I realized my priority is God. Then it's really valuable time with my wife. And then it was my daughter. Mm-hmm. And what's fascinating is, as you look, you see that I think there's always sacrifice, right? So everything below it, you kind of have to sacrifice. And what happens oftentimes is a lesser value takes priority. So I realized one of my values is providing for my family financially, but that was actually taking priority. It was maybe 6 down on the list. It was taking priority over number 2 on the list. And my wife's frustration revealed that. And when I tell people write it down, I ask them, where's your tension point? Is it with your spouse? Is it with your kids? Usually it's because a lesser value is taking priority and we're making the wrong sacrifice. The first story of relational tension in the Bible is with Cain and Abel. And you see that they're making a sacrifice. They're making an offering to the Lord, and Abel's sacrifice gets accepted. Cain's, for whatever reason, doesn't get accepted. There's all sorts of symbolism. We don't know exactly why, but bottom line is Cain gets angry. And God says to him, Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face fallen? If you do well, it'll go right for you. If you don't do well, sin is crouching at your door, but you must rule over it. That word sin, chata in Hebrew, hamartia in Greek, it's an archery term. God's basically telling Cain, you aimed at the wrong thing, buddy. Mm-hmm. And what's fascinating is if you aim at the wrong thing, I think what he's saying is you can make wrong sacrifices. You don't get credit just because you sacrifice. It has to be the right sacrifice that God values. Mm-hmm. And if you make sacrifices and God doesn't value it, you may get the exact same results as actual sin, where you've got regret, remorse. You go, I was trying my best and I didn't sin. I just aimed at the wrong thing. It wasn't what God valued in that season. And you got to make the right sacrifice. The amazing thing is when you make the right sacrifice, God will often resurrect the thing you sacrificed in a more glorious form later. If you look at God, mm-hmm. It's a fascinating thing. God valued himself, then his bride, the church, and then he sacrificed his son for his bride, but then the son was resurrected for a more glorious form. It's pretty profound truth if you look at it. Oftentimes we'll make a sacrifice in one season and God will bring it back to life and he'll say, you made the right sacrifice. Here's the promotion you gave up back in the day to raise your kids, and I'm going to bring it back to life here. That's just God's power to do that.
Yeah, well, yeah, and he knows what's best for us at the time, and mm-hmm. we don't always, which is why that's why the humility of submission and surrender to not my will but yours has such power in it. Now, you've taken guys out and seen them experience this. For the ones, I'm gambling, and don't name names, I know you wouldn't. I'm betting some go and make the changes and some don't. Is that fair?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's hard.
What do you see on the back end of the difference? Because there's got to be a contrast.
Yeah. Well, a lot of guys come to me and they want coaching, right? And usually I'll be like, well, what do you need coaching for? And it takes about 3 sessions for them to finally admit, I'm frustrated with my personal relationships. Because they're so good at work. I mean, these guys are the top of their game at work and they feel competent there. But when they go home, I don't know how to deal with my teenage son or even worse, my teenage daughter. Like, I got no connection point there. So it's easier to just stay at work and just say, well, I'll just throw money at the problem, right? I'll make sure she gets everything I never got. And it's a lot easier. It takes some guts to go, I'm going to go into a vulnerable situation where I'm dealing with something that I'm not as competent. At work, I can kill it. Yeah. At home, I get killed. I feel like I get killed. Right. So it's hard. And, like some guys just say, I just can't do it because they don't like the feeling. Again, it's that humility. They don't like the feeling of not being in control, not knowing what they're doing. But, what I'm convinced of is most of the most challenging things in life, they're not problems to be solved. They're tension points to be managed. You're not going to solve them. It's just constantly managing the tension. And what's important in one season, you got to adjust over here. And then new season happens, the kids leave the house and everything changes. You quit work, you retire, everything changes. And if you're living, Jung said, if you're living the afternoon of life according to the morning of life, it's not going to work out well for you.
So the people that decide I'm gonna keep it light, what do you see inside? More joy, more peace? What do you see?
Yeah. I mean, it literally is, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. I hear a lot of guys say, I've never been happier in my life, and I dropped pretty much everything except for the minimum of what I need. I talked to a guy the other day, he had a ton of real estate, and I asked him, I said, what would happen if everything burned down or a hurricane came through and destroyed everything overnight? And he's like, freedom. I would feel absolute freedom. And that was kind of an epiphany for him. He's like, I need to take this down to a manageable load to where I'm not feeling this constant burden of this. Yeah. And he did. And he's a different guy.
What's crazy is we call those guys successful, and and I've seen it. A lot of times they're just miserable. Yeah. And you're saying no need to be miserable. That's not what we're called to be.
Yeah.
Okay, last question for you. And I want to show people your website real quick. This is joelmalm.com. It looks like Joel, but, we're trying to keep it real here. joelmalm.com. Do you have room on, I'm not asking for myself. I have to clarify. Do you have room on trips? Do you taking people on trips?
Yeah, I do. This year, basically all of our trips are done and full, but next year we're going to fire up full force. We'll do Machu Picchu. We'll be doing something in Maine, probably doing something in Colorado, maybe Yosemite. Summitleaders.com. You can get that, or you can go to my website, joelmalm.com, and it's all on there. Yeah. But yeah, we welcome anyone that's in some sort of a leadership role, and all of us are in leadership as influence. So in some way, we're all in a leadership role. Some of the trips are a little more specialized. I have trips for pastors, specifically, but yeah. And the Malm podcast
on your website. What is that?
Yeah, so it's me talking to Dad about stuff I learned from him growing up. My dad is the man who's most like Jesus that I've ever known.
Love it.
And so we just sit down. I think we got like 200 episodes now. We sit down and talk for 15 minutes about whatever, just whatever I think of. I'm like, hey, Dad, remember that time when I was a kid and you did this? And like, what were you thinking? And we just talk about it. So
yeah, I could do that with my dad, but there's no such thing as a 15-minute talk in his world. They'd be an hour and a half each. So I
have to keep my dad on the rails. That's my job. I keep him on the rails. Yeah.
All right, Joel. I love it. I appreciate you. Did we miss anything? Is there anything before I let you go?
Covered a lot of ground in a short time.
Yeah, we did. It's kind of like, no, it's not like your hikes at all, actually. I was going to try to make the analogy stretch, but we've hit the end of the analogy, and we've hit the end of the program. So I'll just throw you out to joel.com, joelmalm.com. Good Lord. And you can check out the book wherever you get books. Keep it light. Appreciate you guys being here. If you know somebody that's burdened, hit the share button. Let them know. And if you haven't liked, follow, or subscribe, do that. You're getting notifications. And we'll see you next time here on Life Today Live.
The Holy Spirit must be Lord.